Chapter 1. London, England, Spring 1812. Fitzwilliam Darcy's face felt stiff and unbending as the cool evening breeze brushed his skin. His mouth ached with the weight of a frown. The loud chatter and music within the ballroom, filled with sharply attired gentlemen and women wearing fashionable gowns and jewels, grated on him. He abhorred standing around and watching others make merry while he silently stewed. Darcy had no patience with his current situation, so he stepped outside to clear his mind. The balcony's solitude afforded him the perfect haven, away from the petty pleasures of others. The moon was full that night, its silvery rays casting a net across the skies, draping the grounds in its delicate glow. Darcy rested his hands on the balustrade, which was trimmed with flowers, their sweet aroma flooding his senses. He closed his eyes and let his mind wander. His thoughts seemed to drift miles and miles away until the music and laughter faded into the background. At length, footsteps approaching from behind broke his concentration. He darted his eyes around, looking for the source of the footsteps. Charles Bingley, one of his closest friends, was approaching and gave him a quick wave. "What is it, Bingley?" Good-looking and gentlemanlike, Bingley stood nearly as tall as Darcy. Darcy's junior by 2 years, he had a pleasant countenance and easy, unaffected manners. "Come, Darcy," Bingley said. "I must have you come back inside and dance. I hate to see you sulking about by yourself in this stupid manner. You had much better return to the ballroom and dance." Fitzwilliam Darcy scoffed. Absolving himself completely for his current state, he blamed his friend Bingley instead for his being there. Despite his pleasure at being in London, far away from Pemberley, his family's estate in Derbyshire, and his mother's prying eyes, attending such soirees was not his favourite means of passing the time. A single young man of 24, and the future heir to a large fortune, one far too large, in fact, for his own good, he felt he had much rather be at White's with his friends. Bingley, the outgoing fellow he was, had insisted they attend the soiree instead, and he challenged Darcy to a bet. Darcy lost the bet, and the price to pay was attending that night's soiree. It was one thing to attend such a gathering. Darcy surely did not mean to enjoy it. He meant to get through the ordeal without drawing undue attention to himself as much as possible, because he had grown tired of being viewed as the property of eager mammas in want of rich husbands for their silly daughters. Not that he did not enjoy the attention of members of the opposite sex when it suited him. He was not immune to the very great pleasure that a pair of fine eyes in the face of a pretty woman may well bestow. He enjoyed that manner of attention a great deal, just not that particular night. "I certainly shall not," Darcy replied. "You know how I detest it, unless I am particularly acquainted with my partner. I dare say there is not a woman in the room whom it would not be a punishment to me to stand up with." Bingley's expression changed from a smile to a frown. His lips flattened, his eyes narrowed, and he raised one hand to his forehead, as if he were fending off a headache. "I declare I would not be so fastidious as you are for a kingdom," he said. "Upon my honour, the room is flooded with pleasant girls." A couple of giggling girls passed by arm in arm as Bingley was speaking, momentarily diverting his attention. "There are several of them who are uncommonly pretty," he continued. Darcy shook his head and scoffed. His friend Bingley showed a marked tendency to think with his heart instead of his head, and it always led him into one fix or another. Still, that tendency had never landed him in anything that could not be overcome. How unfortunate for the young women involved that Bingley's constancy was as fleeting as the wind. Darcy could have no doubt that whichever young woman fell prey to Bingley's charms was destined for heartbreak in a matter of weeks, if not days. "I am afraid you are wasting your time with me. You had much better return to the dance and do your part to delight and please." "I know you fancy yourself on your discernment as it regards matters of the heart," Bingley said, nodding sagely. "However, I wager there is at least one young lady in attendance this evening who is more than capable of piercing your facade." Darcy lifted a single, perfectly scripted brow. "You and your wagers are what got me into this predicament in the first place, are they not?" "Be that as it may, you must allow me to introduce you to Isabella's friend, the young woman who is visiting her from Hertfordshire. You must have seen her. She arrived with Isabella, and the two of them have been inseparable ever since." Darcy had indeed seen the young woman whom Bingley spoke of, not that he gave her much notice. Miss Isabella Madden, whom he had known for years, was always attracting strays of one ilk or another. What was one more? Besides, whoever the young woman was, she was no doubt inferior to Isabella, who was steeped in elegance and grace, a true sign of good breeding, of wealth, and of privilege. It would not surprise him one bit to learn her friend had connections in trade. How insupportable. As a matter of fact, I did notice Isabella's new acquaintance. What of her? She is very pretty. Surely you cannot deny it. Having met her earlier, I dare say the young lady is very agreeable. Do let me ask Isabella to introduce you. Surely you jest. I have no interest in meeting Isabella's new friend. She is fairly tolerable, but she's not handsome enough to tempt me. Bingley shook his head. What? Darcy asked, his impatience with his friend ever increasing. I suppose I might just as well leave you to yourself. But before I go, might I offer you a bit of advice? As though I have a choice but to listen, Darcy said. What is it then? Is not the book's cover but the writing on the inside that counts? Chapter 2. Owing to the scarcity of gentlemen, Elizabeth Bennet had been obliged to sit down for 2 dances. She did so outside on the balcony. She was not the only person to sit and wait among the shadows of the moon's glow. Watching the clouds drift across the night sky, she heard 2 young men conversing. She was too curious a creature not to pay attention to their debate. Growing up in a household of girls, she rarely had a chance to spend time with the opposite sex, studying their varying quirks and odd proclivities. What would be the harm in listening, Elizabeth wondered. She moved closer to see the gentlemen, yet carefully to avoid being seen by them. As best she could surmise, one of the 2 men was not at all pleased to be at that evening's soirée. The other, Mr. Charles Bingley, whom she had met earlier that evening, was doing his best to persuade the former to return to the festivities. As the more amiable of the 2 was failing miserably in his quest, Elizabeth lost interest in the discussion. She had just resolved to return to the ballroom when the gentlemen's conversation took a turn toward Elizabeth herself. Her momentary joy in being praised for her beauty by one gentleman turned into disgust at having been disparaged by the other. Appalled, Elizabeth rushed back inside, determined to put the matter out of her mind. She is fairly tolerable, but she is not handsome enough to tempt me. A half-hour had not allowed enough time for the sting of the haughty gentleman's words to abate. How had the events of the evening unfolded so dreadfully? Thinking back, Elizabeth recalled having prepared for the ball with extra care that evening, not necessarily because it was her first such ball in London, but rather because of who would be in attendance. It dawned on her as it had never before that her mother had been prescient in having insisted Elizabeth must go to town if she expected to make a good match. Indeed, for she now found herself in the throes of her first crush, at least the first one that signified. From the moment she first heard Mr. Jonathan Hughes speak, Elizabeth was captivated. Something in his air gave the best depiction of his character. Not that he paid the sort of attention to Elizabeth that called for such amorous sentiments on her part. Upon being introduced to him, he had bowed slightly, nodded, and flashed the most devastatingly charming yet innocent smile she could imagine. "It is a pleasure to meet you, Miss Bennet," was all he said, and then he had walked away. As perfunctory as it all had been, it was enough to ignite the glimmer of hope in Elizabeth's heart that she might soon get to know all there was to know about him, starting that very night. For she was sure he would be there, and she was sure he would ask her to dance. And since Elizabeth could think of no more promising means to encourage affection than dancing, the possibility of a most pleasant evening was all but assured. Recalling herself to the present, Elizabeth blew out a frustrated breath. No one liked being the victim of someone else's misery, especially a complete stranger's. "Insufferable man!" she silently screamed. "He is discontented with the ball and his company, but why must that be the means of my current distress?" Elizabeth realised that she had not been meant to overhear the gentleman's uncharitable remark made at her expense, but she was not sure it mattered. That gentleman is just the sort of person who thinks too highly of himself compared to the people around him, and he does not care one fig for the feelings of others. How is it possible that such a fine, tall person with such handsome features is capable of arousing such a degree of disdain with the utterance of so few words? Elizabeth began to pity Mr. Bingley for suffering such an acquaintance. She was sure she never wanted anything to do with the likes of such a man. How unfortunate indeed that upon scanning the room searching for Jonathan Hughes, who was just what a true gentleman ought to be, Elizabeth espied him huddled together with none other than the haughty young man from the balcony. "Who does that gentleman think he is?" "Who does which gentleman think he is, Elizabeth?" asked Miss Isabella Madden, the young lady who had accompanied her to that evening's soirée. Had it not been for Elizabeth's desire to spend time in Mr. Hughes's company, she would have preferred to be anywhere other than that evening's gathering. However, Isabella was always eager for entertainment. Given the young lady's blossoming acquaintance, Elizabeth surmised she would often attend such outings. Solitary rambles about the countryside in Hertfordshire were Elizabeth's idea of a pleasurable pastime, not feigning indifference over the slights of those who considered her beneath them in consequence, owing to their forebears' situations in life. She was a long way from Hertfordshire. "Elizabeth," the young lady said, trying to garner her friend's attention. Elizabeth's mind was too busily engaged with thoughts of the haughty gentleman and his connection to Mr. Hughes to respond at once. After a moment or so she asked, "Pray, who is that gentleman standing over there with your cousin, the tall one who looks like he just tasted a bad lemon?" "Oh, that is Mr. Fitzwilliam Darcy. Despite his dour countenance at present, I dare say he is one of the most handsome men in all of England. What's more, he is the heir to one of the finest estates in the country, as well as half of Derbyshire." "Which half would that be? Surely not the most agreeable half." "Surely you jest. Mr. Darcy is one of the most sought-after young men in all of England." "Does that include you, Isabella?" "Heavens forbid. Mr. Darcy is much too fastidious for my taste. However, you might like him. Shall I introduce you to him?" Elizabeth scoffed. "I am sure I would not wish to be introduced to Mr. Darcy even if he were the last man in the world." How unfortunate that Elizabeth's assertion coincided with a lull in the music, and her voice carried all the way across the room to where the gentleman stood. Mr. Darcy's expression was haughty and severe. He glared at Elizabeth for what seemed like an eternity before he finally broke eye contact with her and resumed his former attitude, speaking with the gentleman who stood beside him. Elizabeth could feel the colour spreading all over her body. True, he had spoken meanly of her earlier that evening, but she was not one to repay unkindness with unkindness. She much preferred to contend with her detractors with more grace and wit than she had shown. Making matters worse, he was standing with Mr. Hughes, whose good opinion meant everything to her. Isabella, having been shocked by her friend's speech and having seen Mr. Darcy's reaction, cried, "What on earth do you have against poor Mr. Darcy?" Still reeling from Mr. Darcy's silent rebuke, Elizabeth summoned her spirits to playfulness. "Poor? I thought you said he stands to inherit half of Derbyshire." "I did indeed, but is that any reason to dislike him? He's one of my cousin's closest friends, which makes him a dear friend of mine as well. I so wanted the two of you to get along." Hearing that Mr. Darcy was one of Mr. Jonathan Hughes's closest friends made Elizabeth a bit uneasy. The possibility that her unkind words spoken about his friend might garner his disapprobation was not something she wanted. Her voice contrite, she said, "Pray do not fret, Isabella. I did not know Mr. Darcy meant so much to you and your cousin. I shall find a way to make amends with him, I promise." "Even if it kills me," Elizabeth considered. "I am delighted to hear that," Isabella said. "I foresee all of us spending a good deal of time in one another's company in the coming weeks, at my family's country estate in Hampshire. The last thing we need is warring factions between the sexes, for my cousin and his friends are as thick as thieves. So we ladies must stick together. Indeed, I mean for all of us to get along swimmingly." Chapter 3. That someone so far beneath him in consequence dared speak so callously of him for all the world to hear robbed Darcy of his composure. Who does she think she is? "It looks as though, where sensible young ladies are concerned, your reputation precedes you, my friend," said Jonathan Hughes, with a hint of amusement in his tone. Still reeling from the impertinent young woman's offence against him, Darcy glared at his friend for making light of the situation. Usually he would not mind Jonathan's humour. However, he was flustered by the young lady's apparent disdain toward him. "I am glad you are amused." "Who that knows you as I do would not be amused?" "What does that mean? Surely I deserve better than to be laughed at by someone of such little consequence." Most women he had met were so enamoured with his looks and his family's wealth and position in society that they practically threw themselves at him. Darcy's friend, who was handsome in his own right, shook his head. "I take it you are acquainted with her," Darcy said. The other young man nodded. "Indeed." "Who is she?" Darcy asked, his patience waning. "She is Miss Elizabeth Bennet, and she hails from a small town in Hertfordshire." Darcy scoffed. "Just as I suspected. No one special from no place special." Rubbing his brow, Jonathan shook his head again. "Come, Darcy," he said. "You may as well become acquainted with Miss Bennet, for if my cousin Isabella has her way, all of us shall soon be spending immense time in one another's company." Were it not for the fact that the man who had considered her not handsome enough to tempt him was headed her way with Mr. Hughes, Elizabeth was sure she would have fled Isabella's side. Instead, the closer the two gentlemen came, the more her eyes were drawn away from her first object, Mr. Hughes, and towards the other man. Mr. Darcy stood a couple inches taller than his friend. His beauty exceeded that of every other man in the room, which was really something because theretofore Elizabeth had never seen a man as handsome as Mr. Hughes. Mr. Darcy's dark, brooding eyes were hypnotic, and his hair, though boasting of loose curls, was perfectly formed. She had not seen such perfection in all her time in London. Elizabeth, however, did not mean to be swayed. He was a handsome man, but his appearance did not blind her to the unpleasant things he had said about her. In fact, I should not have been surprised that someone who spoke so maliciously could be so handsome. Those who think higher of themselves than they do of others do so for a reason, do they not? Isabella gently nudged Elizabeth's arm. "Jonathan and Mr. Darcy are coming this way. Now remember, you promised you would be kind to Mr. Darcy." Isabella took it upon herself to introduce Elizabeth and Mr. Darcy. Then she promptly coaxed her cousin to the side for a private tete-a-tete, thus leaving the other couple to their own devices. Mr. Darcy's ensuing silence took Elizabeth by surprise. He had plenty to say, nay complain about, to his friend Mr. Bingley outside on the balcony. Is he still fuming over my outburst? She had been mortified by her ill-spoken words and flushed with embarrassment, and had thought she was going to die right then and there. She had not meant to say anything unkind or uncivil aloud. Her words had been uttered in a moment of impetuosity, unlike his insult, which had been levelled with purpose and precision. Perhaps Mr. Darcy means to intimidate me, and if that is the case, he has chosen the wrong person. My courage always arises amid such attempts. "I do hope you are enjoying the evening, Mr. Darcy," said Elizabeth. "It would be more accurate to say that I am looking forward to enjoying myself as much as I can, now that I have had the good fortune of making your acquaintance," he said, casting a look full of meaning at her. Her eyes searching his, Elizabeth tried not to gape. "Is this the same man who spoke so recklessly to Mr. Bingley?" Darcy found himself entranced by Elizabeth's eyes as she met his gaze. The initial shock he saw in them was promptly replaced with a hint of amusement, as if she found something diverting. At that very moment he knew he wanted to know her better. What a fool I was for speaking so unkindly of her earlier. Her dark, beguiling eyes, her light and pleasing figure, she is more than capable of tempting me. You will forgive me for not reciprocating the sentiment, I pray. Rather than take offence, Darcy half smiled. Is my standing here not a testament to my forgiving nature? Elizabeth arched her brow. I suppose I ought to apologise for my unkind remark. One would suppose, but as impertinent as you are, one likely ought not to expect. She drew a quick breath. Impertinence, Mr. Darcy, is in the eye of the beholder, and even if I were impertinent, I have good reason to be, and you know it. Darcy held up his hand in mock surrender. Impertinence is not necessarily a fault. Then, letting down his hands and leaning in closer, he said, On the contrary, I find yours refreshing. I dare say it sets you miles apart from all of the other young ladies of my acquaintance, which bodes well for you, I assure you. Am I to take that as a compliment? Darcy resumed his former attitude. Coming from me, you should take it as a compliment indeed, one that comes straight from my heart. Sir, Elizabeth said. Pray, may I have the next dance, Miss Bennet? Darcy asked, taking Elizabeth by surprise as her countenance attested, and effectively silencing her protest. Returning to his friend's side, Jonathan said, I believe you promised the next set to me, did you not, Miss Bennet? And so I did, Elizabeth replied, her smile brighter. She looked at Darcy. Knowing how much you abhor the act unless you are particularly acquainted with your partner, perhaps we may be afforded such opportunities in the future, she said. Now, if you will pardon me, I believe I shall avail myself of a refreshment before the dance resumes. Allow me to accompany you, said Hughes, extending his arm to Elizabeth. Whatever Hughes said in a voice meant for her ears only caused Elizabeth to laugh, and it was the most beautiful thing Darcy had heard in his life. When she laughed, her eyes sparkled and her cheeks glowed. His hands tucked behind his back, Darcy simply stared as his friend escorted Elizabeth to the other part of the room. Her last remark could only mean one thing. She had been privy to his conversation with Bingley. At least the reason for her own incivility now made sense to him. Darcy's task was clear, that of making amends for his insult. What choice did he have? One thing was certain. He had never been so bewitched by any woman as he was by Miss Elizabeth Bennet. Chapter 4. "You must be wondering how I came to know Miss Bennet," said Isabella, drawing Darcy's attention away from his friend on the other side of the room, speaking with Miss Bennet as if she were more important than the rest of the world to him. "You no doubt mean to tell me. I am therefore obliged to listen," Darcy said, his disinterested tone belying his intrigue with the captivating young woman, and his distress at seeing her easy manner with his friend. Isabella chuckled. "You might say our families are old acquaintances. Her aunt, Mrs. Madeline Gardiner, and my aunt, Mrs. Anna Samuels, attended seminary together back in their hometown. They have kept up their friendship ever since. So when Elizabeth, Miss Bennet, left her home in Hertfordshire to live with her aunt and uncle here in town, my aunt thought it would be a splendid idea if I were to accept her dearest friend's niece into my circle of acquaintances so she might spend her time around people of her own age." Darcy sipped his champagne and let his eyes rest once again on Miss Bennet. "So, you agreed without hesitation to such an arrangement," he said. "How magnanimous of you to go along with your aunt's scheme. I assure you that I suffer no burden having done so. On the contrary, the two of us have grown quite close during the short duration of our acquaintance, so much so that I have invited Elizabeth to attend our party when we all journey to Hampshire in a few days." She looked at Darcy questioningly. "You're still planning to join us, I pray?" Darcy nodded. Still watching Elizabeth conversing with his friend, he said, "I would not miss spending time away from town with close friends for anything in the world. And especially now with the new addition to our party," he thought, but dared not voice aloud. Indeed, visions of spending time with the young woman flashed through his mind. His heart ached as he watched her laugh at something his friend said. He noticed the enthusiastic expression on her face, and the way she moved her hands throughout their intimate intercourse. How appealing she is! A pleasing figure, an animated face, a charming smile. She cannot always be so enthralled with Hughes. I shall command my share of her attention soon enough. I have no doubt I will find her very captivating indeed." His eyes fixed on Elizabeth standing closer to his friend than he would have preferred, Darcy continued, "You mentioned Miss Bennet left her home to live here in London with her relations." Isabella nodded. "Yes, she hails from Hertfordshire. Her family's estate is Longbourn Village, near to Meryton. Her father owns an estate which certainly bodes well. Add to that she's not wholly without connections. Otherwise she would not be Isabella's friend," Darcy silently considered. Isabella lowered her eyes. "Unfortunately," she began, her tone sad, "Elizabeth's father passed away a few years ago. Her eldest sister became obliged to marry Longbourn's heir, a distant cousin, owing to an entail on the estate." Darcy's face softened with concern. "I am sorry to hear that Miss Bennet lost her father at such an early age," he said. "I do not envy her one bit in having suffered such a loss." Indeed, as much as he was always at odds with his own father and mother of late, especially his mother, Lady Anne Darcy, Darcy could not imagine his life without either of them. "Yes, it is terrible to lose a parent at such an early age. I understand the late Mr. Bennet's passing was quite a blow for all of them." "How did he die?" Isabella's eyes grew sadder and she shook her head. "I am not sure of the particulars, but I do know he was ill for quite a long time before passing." His brow creased. Darcy said, "I see." The thought of one's parents suffering a long time and eventually succumbing to death is not something I would wish upon anyone. However, Elizabeth's eldest sister's marriage mitigated the family's loss, thus sparing her mother and younger sisters worse fates. And her relatives here in London, precisely where do they reside? Grosvenor Square? Or Mayfair, perhaps? "Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner reside on Gracechurch Street," said Isabella. Darcy's brow furrowed. "Gracechurch Street?" "Yes, in Cheapside." He felt the colour spread all over his body. He took a step back. Cheapside? Darcy was in disbelief. Though he had never ventured to that part of town, he was familiar with its reputation as a less than desirable area. Who but tradesmen live in that part of London? The sort of people who were so far beneath his noble relations as to be considered laughable, his late grandfather having been the Earl of Matlock, and his uncle now being the Earl. "Having relations in Cheapside does not make my friend one jot less agreeable," cried Isabella with energy. "But it must very materially lessen her chance of marrying a man of any consideration in the world," replied Darcy. It pained him to say so, his hopes of getting better acquainted with Elizabeth diminishing like an eclipse of the sun consuming the light. "Having met Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner on more than one occasion, I am persuaded they are very fashionable people. Their circumstances afford them no cause to repine. Elizabeth shall have no shortage of suitors, of that I am certain. She is a beautiful, charming young woman, said Isabella, smiling as though oblivious to Darcy's disappointed hopes. Despite her father's passing, she will always be a gentleman's daughter. I imagine there are dozens of young men who would happily marry her if given the opportunity. However, Elizabeth is determined to live her life on her own terms. Indeed, she refuses to marry for anything other than love. Darcy scanned the ballroom, imagining every man there jumping at the chance to marry Miss Elizabeth Bennet if given the opportunity. After learning what he had learned, he shook his head. Then he released a deep breath. I, for one, will not be counted among them. Chapter 5. Hampshire, 1 week later. Mrs. Fanny Bennet, Elizabeth's mother and the former mistress of Longbourn near Meryton in Hertfordshire, deserved credit for her second eldest daughter living in Cheapside with the Gardiners. Her eldest, Jane, had done her part to save the Bennet family from destitution, but 4 other girls remained to get rid of. With such meagre dowries, what was their chance to make anything other than meagre matches, assuming they were lucky enough? Jane was the real beauty in the family, but Elizabeth was always considered the second in beauty. What was more, Elizabeth was clever. If any of the other girls were to attract the notice of a wealthy suitor, it was her. With that thought in mind, her mother had packed up her things and sent her to town. Elizabeth could hardly complain, especially not that particular day, despite having been thrust into a society foreign to that enjoyed by her family and acquaintances in Meryton. Miss Isabella Madden's family and acquaintances were steeped in aristocracy on her mother's side. Lady Sophie Madden, Isabella's mother, had married a country gentleman who was her senior by more than 2 decades. The latter passed away years ago, leaving his wife and only child to mourn his loss. Both Elizabeth and her new friend Isabella were gentlemen's daughters, making them equal. Both cherished the memories of most beloved fathers, but only one was the heiress of a large fortune, and one was not. Slowly strolling down the corridor, Elizabeth studied the opulence throughout her friend's country home halls. There was no hiding the vastness of the Madden family's wealth. What a striking contrast to Elizabeth's family's fortune. Longbourn was nothing by comparison. Elizabeth would not have dreamed of thinking this way about Longbourn Estate when her father lived, for then it truly felt like her home. However, in the wake of her father's death and her elder sister's marriage to the estate's heir, Mr. William Collins, Longbourn felt like anything but her home. Longbourn's new master was nothing like Elizabeth's late father, Mr. Thomas Bennet. Mr. Bennet had been an odd mixture of quick parts, sarcastic humour, reserve, and caprice. He was by no means a saint. Some had complained that he was a recluse who cared more about his own convenience than his family. But, on the other hand, there was no denying his preference for Elizabeth, emboldening a fiercely independent temperament in her. The only things the new master encouraged in Elizabeth were ridicule and disdain. Where gratitude ought to have existed, there was indignation instead, owing to his pomposity and officiousness. In short, the new master was the opposite of his predecessor. As painful as it was to see her dearest sister commit to such an existence, Elizabeth was prudent enough to know it was the only way. In the absence of the marriage, Mr. Collins would have been well within his rights to toss her family into the hedgerows. One consolation Elizabeth kept close to her heart was in the form of her elder sister's parting words the day Elizabeth left. The 2 of them had always imagined they would marry for love. Perhaps had their parents given birth to a son to break the entail on Longbourn, they might have realised their favourite wish. But alas, such was not to be. Jane was now married to a man she did not love when the 2 exchanged vows, a man she might never love, at least not in the way young ladies built their dreams upon. So, Jane encouraged Elizabeth to do what she could not, follow her heart wherever it might lead, and marry only when she had found the deepest love. Only then would Jane's own happiness be complete. The sound of the pianoforte emanating throughout the halls drew Elizabeth's footsteps to the music room, where she stopped just inside the open doorway. She stood frozen, as if taking a step closer would pierce the incredible bliss enveloping the room. What an extraordinary gentleman he is, she pondered, taking in the view. She would stay in that exact spot for hours if she had her way. She reflected on the first time she saw Mr. Hughes. She recalled comparing his beauty to nothing she had ever seen before, likening his face to that of an angel, and his smile to the rising sun. Mother Nature left nothing undone where Mr. Hughes was concerned. Of that Elizabeth was confident. Earlier that day she had watched him in silence as he sat alone in a wooden alcove with his violin on his shoulder. He played a beautiful rendition of Bach's Chaconne from Partita No. 1. 2 inches. The sun rays bursting light in spring buds falling from the trees like snowflakes drifting in the air made the moment too blissful to interrupt. So perfectly composed the gentleman played with poise and precision, absorbed in his music. The handsome young gentleman's fingers danced on the keys with flair. His instrument was an extension of his body. His every movement was fluid and graceful, creating music that flowed effortlessly from his mind to the keys, making Elizabeth wonder if everything Jonathan Hughes did he did with such splendour. "You are staring at me, Miss Bennet." "I beg your pardon," Elizabeth said, before turning to escape down the hallway. "No, stay," she heard him say. "Do you play?" "A little," Elizabeth confessed, stopping, slowly turning back and stepping inside the room. "Come," he said, standing and waving Elizabeth closer. "No, I do not dare." "Are you afraid you might put my performance to shame?" "No, on the contrary. It is more likely that I am the one who would suffer the greater share of shame, for you see, I never take time to practice as I should. I fear you will find me wanting." "Then what say you to your turning the pages for me? I dare say I cannot possibly find you wanting in that respect." Elizabeth smiled and took her place by Mr. Hughes's side as he resumed his former attitude. "I shall do my best," she said. "I am sure you will not fail me," he teased. Then, after Hughes found the desired music sheet, he turned and gazed at Elizabeth. "The next time the two of us find ourselves in this position, Miss Bennet, I shall expect you to exhibit while I turn the pages," he said. Then he leaned closer. "You can have no doubt of what I expect of you until then." Sitting that close to the object of her fascination, feeling the warmth of his breath gently caressing her skin, Elizabeth struggled to remember how to breathe. She bit her lip as he kept up his attitude, seemingly oblivious to his effect on her. Before she could fashion a response, Hughes pulled away and readied his fingers on the keyboard. "Practice, practice, practice," he said, his warm smile more than compensating for the absence of his nearness. Again he beamed at her, and Elizabeth again felt she could not look away from him. This man, who seemed much too good to be true, fascinated her. Elizabeth had never been so captivated by anyone as she was by him. Yet similarly, she had never felt so conflicted. She was sure she did not want Mr. Hughes to know how much he affected her, yet she could not help but continue staring at him. Chapter 6. Be careful what you wish for. Those words echoed through Darcy's mind whenever he recalled for a single second how he had at first looked forward to the addition of Miss Elizabeth Bennet to their country party. The sensation of his stomach sinking when he learned of her low sphere in life compared to his own lingered still. Even knowing what he knew about her, what with her lack of fortune and her connections to tradesmen, Darcy found himself slightly intrigued by the young woman. He could not put his finger on it, but there was something about Miss Bennet that robbed him of his equanimity. More than likely his curiosity was piqued, because she was quite unlike any other young woman of his acquaintance. He had even seen her from his apartment window wandering about the grounds during the early morning hours on more than one occasion since their arrival in Hampshire. Unescorted, no less. What proper young lady comports herself in such a manner? He had no idea what to think of her. Then, too, there was Miss Bennet's unabashed fascination with his friend Jonathan Hughes. Darcy could have no doubt that the young lady's fixation was entirely one-sided. There was only one woman in the world for Hughes. Everyone who knew anything about the inner workings of Hughes's heart knew precisely who she was. Lady Contessa Bridges, a beautiful young heiress. What did it matter to Jonathan that Lady Contessa was several years his senior? He had loved her with all his heart for so long as Darcy could recall. Indeed, it was an ardent devotion that had been years in the making, even though Hughes had yet to offer his hand to the young woman. Willing his thoughts to more pressing matters, Darcy shook his head. He and Charles Bingley had just returned from a strenuous ride across the countryside. They were about to embark upon their next diversion with the other gentlemen in their party. Accordingly, Darcy searched for Hughes. Bingley set off in search of Theodore Zander, a close friend who rounded out their cohort of handsome, single, and, last but not least, wealthy gentlemen. The familiar ring of someone playing the pianoforte drew Darcy to the music room. He wished he could say he was surprised to find Jonathan sitting at the instrument with Miss Bennet, But he was not. He had espied her in a mesmerised state earlier that same day, watching Hughes play the violin in his favourite alcove at the Madden country estate. While Darcy had not let either of the two know of his presence, he showed no such restraint this time. It was much too pleasant a day for his friend to be cooped up inside, squandering their time together with the besotted young woman whose low circumstances in life rendered her inconsequential in their world, even if she did have the most bewitching eyes Darcy's own eyes had ever beheld. At that moment, Miss Bennet was gazing intently at Jonathan, as if he were not of the earth, but the sun itself. Darcy could not help but wonder what she was thinking. She was obviously deeply enamoured of the young gentleman. He did not envy the rude awakening that awaited her one bit. Perhaps it will teach her not to aspire to a situation in life beyond her station. Undetected, Darcy moved closer to where the couple sat as the melody carried on uninterrupted. Jonathan smiled when he finally noticed Darcy standing in front of the instrument. Darcy also noticed Miss Bennet blushing deeply at his presence. The young lady rose from her seat and curtsied to him. "Mr. Darcy, how nice of you to join us." Darcy felt his heart flutter, his cheeks flush, and his hands grow clammy. The air in the room seemed to grow thinner. Darcy, who was always known for his cool, calm demeanour, was feeling nervous. He could not form the most commonplace of greetings with those dark, bewitching eyes set on him. A single word escaped his lips. Elizabeth. Darcy had spoken her given name without realising that he was doing it. His action made Jonathan and Miss Bennet stare at him. Darcy needed a moment to collect himself. "What is happening to me?" Bowing, he tried again. "Miss Bennet." The sooner he got away from her, the better. He faced his friend. "Did you forget our plans for the afternoon?" Jonathan looked at Darcy as if he had no idea what he was talking about. "Plans?" Darcy nodded. "The four of us, Xander, Bingley, you, me. We have a standing engagement in the billiards room." Jonathan's brow wrinkled. Darcy raised his hands in mock surrender. "Of course, if you would rather ruin a perfectly good afternoon serenading Miss Bennet, who am I to complain?" Jonathan stood. "No, we were finishing here. Were we not, Miss Bennet?" he asked politely, his voice devoid of any sarcasm akin to his friend's. Miss Bennet's blush deepened, and she too stood. Then she replied in a small voice, "Yes, we were." "Do not forget your promise, Miss Bennet," said Jonathan, his brilliant smile intact as he headed toward the doorway with Darcy by his side. "Promise?" Darcy silently inquired, throwing a perplexed gaze over his shoulder on the way out the door. The gentleman went ahead to the billiards room, where Darcy and Jonathan commenced playing. At the same time, Theodore Xander and Charles Bingley were heavily engaged in a conversation across the room. Part of Darcy's thoughts were still in the music room. A faint, sweet, yet melancholy sound filled the air, constantly reminding him she was still there. He had lost 3 rounds in a row, and he silently cursed himself for allowing someone like her to distract him. At length, he sighed. "Are you not the least bit concerned by Miss Bennet's behaviour?" Without even looking up from the billiards table, Jonathan replied, "It is your behaviour that puzzles me." "My behaviour?" Jonathan smiled knowingly at his friend and then took his shot. "Your turn," Jonathan said, pointing at the billiards table. Several minutes later, Darcy was still thinking about his friend's retort as he tried to take his shot. He threw down his cue. "What are you insinuating about my behaviour?" "I am not insinuating anything. I am simply observing facts." "Facts?" "The fact that you always feign indifference to Miss Bennet, yet whenever the two of you are in the same room, you cannot take your eyes off her. The fact that this is the worst I have ever seen you play. No doubt your mind is busily engaged with thoughts of her." Darcy picked up his cue again. "You're wrong. You're very much wrong." Jonathan shrugged his shoulders. "Suit yourself." Bingley and Xander joined Darcy and Hughes at the billiards table. "What are the two of you going on about?" Bingley asked. "Miss Bennet and her uncanny effect on Darcy's sensibilities." "Miss Elizabeth Bennet?" Xander asked. He laid a hand on Darcy's shoulder. "Do you have an interest in her that I am unaware of?" Darcy blushed. "Of course not." "Then what, may I ask, is bothering you so?" Darcy opened his mouth to answer, but for the life of him, he could not come up with any reason for his behaviour. "I do not know," he finally admitted. "Well, I do," Jonathan said with a smirk. "I think it is becoming increasingly obvious that you are slowly but surely falling in love with her." Darcy glared at his friend. "You speak nonsense." He slammed his cue stick down on the table. Jonathan had to laugh at Darcy's discomfiture. "Do I?" "Now that I think of it, you do have a habit of staring at the young woman," Bingley said. "No, I do not," Darcy said, his eyes staring at the table. "It is preposterous, and you all know it. There is no way I could feel anything for her." "Precisely," Xander said, leaning on a cue stick. "How can such an idea even come to anyone's mind? You are, after all, a Darcy of Pemberley. She is merely the daughter of a penniless country gentleman and a mother who comes from trade. Imagine how your mother would react were she to find out about your fascination with such a young woman," Bingley asked. "She barely tolerates me, what with my family's past, and the two of us have been friends for years." Darcy stared at him. Then he picked up his cue stick and threw it on the table again. "Be quiet," he said. Thank you for listening to Mr. Darcy, the Heir of Pemberley, chapters 1 through 6. If you have enjoyed this story thus far, and I hope you have, you will not want to miss what happens next. Subscribe to this channel today and be among the first to be notified when Mr. Darcy, the Heir of Pemberley, the complete audiobook is available for your listening pleasure. Your support through likes, comments, subscribes and shares helps this channel grow. Thank you again for all you do.